Mhm. Okay, so to get a complete picture of what you're trying to arrive at with your work, I guess it is also very important for us to understand how representative processes that occur in the brain arose from from processes of natural selection, right? And I mean, even at a certain point, when you were referring to vegetative sentience, it came to my mind that perhaps most of the representations that go around in our brain, we're not really aware of them. And I mean, there are many processes that go around, many operations that our brain does that we're not conscious about. So, I mean, even the consciousness part of things is not really that crucial to understand how these things happen, right?
What I would say is that we have been trapped into thinking in a sort of Cartesian sense that the consciousness part of our brain and the unconsciousness part of our brain are really separate. And the way I like to think about it is to deconstruct the notion of consciousness into a relatively differentiated form of teleodynamics. And I think we've fallen into the mistake of thinking of brain functions like we think about computing functions. And we these days oftentimes let these metaphors run easily back and forth between brain processes and these devices that we've created. On the other hand, we've forgotten the fact that brains, as you said, evolved biologically. Biology does not produce complexity the way that we produce complexity. And let me give you an example. When I want to create a complex thing, an artifact, I find a lot of things and I bring them together and I assemble them. I find a bunch of parts and I put them together in just the right way. I have a plan and I have a goal in mind, a telos, an end, a purpose. And if I'm lucky and my logic is correct, I'll get that function out in the end. When living things produce complexity, they don't put things together. My body was generated by starting from something that was already together, a fertilized ovum, a single cell, but it was undifferentiated. It did not have hands and feet and eyes and so on. What happened is over time, that system, by virtue of processes that involve morphodynamic processes, self-organizing processes, and involve evolution-like processes, selection-like processes as well, the embryo progressively differentiated. Complexity is produced in biology by beginning from undifferentiated whole systems that are already functioning, that are already complete in that sense, that then progressively differentiate. I think we need to recognize that if an evolved part of our bodies is there to generate complexity, it's almost certainly going to use biological logic to do it, not artifact logic to do it. Thoughts and cognition differentiate. They don't get created at the top level with an algorithm that's already organized. They differentiate. That means they start from an undifferentiated form. Before I've produced this sentence, I have an idea, we say, this sort of crude, vague idea of what I want to talk about. But it's not a collection of words that I'm going to assemble. Yeah, the words were there in English, but that's not what I assembled. I differentiated that thought into words. And that means that there's a whole lot of processes that I'm thinking of as unconscious because they're undifferentiated. They are like that early stage embryo that doesn't have all the parts yet. And as that embryonic thought differentiates, matures, so to speak, to become a sentence or to become an idea that's clear, what's happened is that I've become more and more conscious of it as well. That is, consciousness is continually differentiating. It's not something that's just sort of at the top, floating on top of all of this machinery. But we tend to think about consciousness that way because the only part that we really attend to is sort of the end product, what I'm saying now. But in fact, I'm liminally conscious of all this other stuff. It's still going on. And in fact, if I had a sudden stroke and some little bit of that process was disturbed, it would become conscious to me. It would become conscious because the end differentiation process would no longer be what I expected and anticipated. That is, the differentiation would have been modified. So what I'm suggesting is that to some extent we have misconceived brain function. We've misconceived brain function by using this computational metaphor, this engineering metaphor, to apply too strongly to what's going on. As a result, we're going to have to rethink this process. We have to rethink brains as biologists, not as computer scientists, in order to figure out how it works. That also means that we can rethink computation and the things that we build to do this work. If we're ever going to produce what you might call not artificial intelligence, but artifactual intelligence, we're going to have to do it like brains do it. And that's a very different process. And so part of my interest is to sort of deal with that, to think about mental processes, neurological processes as differentiation processes. How do you rethink brain function and anatomy in those terms?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now for the last part of the interview, I would like to talk with you about the work you've done on language and semiotics. So I would like to ask you, how does semiotics work for you? Because I guess that the way semiotics originally as a discipline worked was that, and I might be mistaken about this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that initially people in semiotics were too focused on the symbols, and they were not really interested in trying to biologically ground the processes that they were describing. But you are interested in that, so could you tell us about that?
I think you've characterized that well, and it's really because there are two, you might say, two lineages that have not been fully resolved. One lineage begins with my favorite philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, who actually coined the term semiotics, although he borrows it from John Locke, who used the term initially to talk about cognition and so on. But what Charles Peirce was interested in was, in fact, just the inverse of what you're talking about. That is, to some extent, not all thought is in the form of symbols or words. We human beings, we're so anthropocentric, we sort of think of everything in linguistic terms. That as though language is the be-all and end-all of communication, and other forms of communication are sort of lesser or ancillary to this. As a biologist, it's very clear to me that language, symbolic thought, is the most odd, the most recent, the most unusual form of communication to have evolved. And as a result, it evolved out of other forms of communication that precede it and, in fact, undergird it, are its foundation. And Charles Peirce was very interested in talking about all the ways that information is encoded, is passed on, and so on, and interpreted. The other strain comes from people who studies linguistics, and basically, I think, traces a lot of its focus back on a man named Ferdinand de Saussure, who initiated what we might call modern structural linguistics. And he argued that what you really have to pay attention to is the relationship between what he called a signifier, like a word, and a signified, the idea or thing it represents. And as a result, thinking from language, that's all you have to worry about. The problem there is that this signifier-signified relationship looks sort of like a code relationship. And it often has brought to mind issues of arbitrarity, for example. So that the signifier, the word that I'm using right now, it has very little in common, except that we've accepted it has in common with what it's referring to. On the other hand, a picture carries some of the form of that which it's referring. A fever is directly correlated with the body state that might be inferred from studying the fever. Charles Peirce was more interested in those and, in effect, recognized that iconic, that is, likeness representations, and indexical, these correlated representations, were more basic than language, more basic than symbolic communication, and, in fact, that symbolic communication, to some extent, grows out of them. Now, as a biologist studying the origins of language, I became interested initially in other animals' forms of communication. And they do not use words or anything like words. They use a lot of icons and indices. That is, they use a lot of likenesses in their behavior, a lot of anticipatory behaviors, but also a lot of indexical behaviors. Vocalizations mostly indicate a state of emotionality or arousal. In fact, for you and I, we also have these. Laughter and sobbing are good examples of these things that are very good indications of a particular state of mind, including things like smiling and gesturing with our hands and so on. They don't have definitions, for example, where words might have a definition. You know, what's the definition of a smile or a laugh? Well, it doesn't have those things. And not only that, the other difference is that words are interdefined. We define words with other words. We don't define laughs with respect to grimaces and cries and waving of the hands or winks. No, it's not. They're defined with respect to their immediate linkage with a state of mind, a state of arousal. So what I realized early on in the study of language is that you couldn't study the origins of language and how we gained this possibility without understanding how it developed out of these other forms of sign. And that required semiotics, not just linguistics. Semiotics is an attempt to say, what are all the possible ways that information about things can be passed on? And what are the different structures? Peirce's identification of these three modes, iconic, indexical, and symbolic, helped me understand that, and helped me understand that to interpret symbols, to interpret words, we actually have to use the way that words index other words. We have to have them bring to mind icons, sensory experiences, likenesses. And when we analyze a sentence, it's sort of like analyzing a diagram. The way the words relate to each other has a structure, and that structure is sort of like the idea structure behind that. And a structure, of course, is a form, is an icon. So to some extent, what I realized is that the only way you could really study the origins of language was, first of all, to get a really good handle on how the symbolic capacities were built upon iconic and indexical capacities. And more recently, it's led me to realize that every child has to deal with this problem. That is, they have to, in the first 2 years of life, figure out how to use sign vehicles, symbols, that don't carry any hints in their structure about what they're about. This has sometimes been called ungrounded signs. These signs aren't grounded because they don't carry anything in their intrinsic features that allow you to figure out what it's about. But children begin life dealing with exactly this problem and trying to communicate with adults and other children. That is, they need to be grounded. They need to figure out how to get things, how to get people's attention, how to aim somebody else's attention to what you want by pointing, for example, using all kinds of iconic and indexical capacities. And they have to use these to sort of figure out how then to use sign vehicles that don't have these properties to do the same thing. And this is a problem that I like to call the moving towards ungrounding, the ungrounding process. The advantage of being able to use sign vehicles that don't have these characteristics is that they're much more manipulable. By combining them, instead of having each one of them have all the information, you can now produce much more diversity of reference, much more freedom to communicate, and as we know now, to encode almost anything, including all the novel ideas we've been talking about today, things that one may not have thought about before this. That's the power of it, but you can't do that if your sign vehicles carry within them the structure of what they represent. You have to, in a sense, have moved to this symbolic level where you've thrown that away. But that means the relationships between the symbols, between the words and the morphemes, the endings and the beginnings of words and so on, have to carry the iconic and indexical functions. So that grammar and syntax ought to be reanalyzed semiotically. And one of the things I'm trying to urge my linguistic colleagues to do is to get out of the mode that they think that, no, words are just sort of arbitrarily related to the world and you need rules to organize them. No, what you need is to recognize that the relationships between words, those relationships, the spaces, so to speak, the connections, have to be doing the iconic and indexical work. And that means that grammar and syntax should itself be explainable semiotically. But you've got to get to semiotics. You've got to get to icons and indices. If you stay with just symbols, you can never see it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if language is the result of several cognitive building blocks that we have acquired through our evolutionary history, let's say, of course, I guess that we share some of them with other species, right? So would you say that language is strictly a human cognitive phenomenon, or that might be other species that also have it?
Well, so the first thing that I did as a graduate student, I spent a little more than a decade trying to understand what was different about human brains that made language possible that seemed so unlikely to show up in any other species. The surprising feature is that every time I looked, it was something in common. There are no new major structures in the human brain. It's not really structured differently. It's a fairly typical ape brain. Yes, it's bigger, and there's some proportional differences, and maybe a few connectional differences, but they're pretty subtle. And yet, language is so radically unusual in the animal world. So, it was this troublesome problem that the substrate didn't look that different, but the result of this function was radically different. Not only that, most vocalization communication is not controlled cortically in other species. It's controlled mostly subcortically in the midbrain and in the basal forebrain. And yet most of language requires cortex. Interestingly enough, a recent study done here at Berkeley by some of my colleagues has shown that almost the entire cerebral cortex is involved in understanding meaning of words. So there's this wonderful study in which they look at how words are effectively meaning extraction from words is tiled across the cerebral cortex. Almost all of both hemispheres are involved in word analysis. So that to some extent what's happened is that these are structures that evolved to do other things. Movement, auditory processes and so on, and visual processes. They still do those things, but they've also been recruited into language as well. So something has happened to re-recruit all of these structures to do this wonderful new thing that we're doing right now. That makes us radically different in so many things, and of course has changed the world because of it. But now what's interesting is that one has to then understand, so what's the subtle change that made this possible? And how did it come about? Now, the real problem, of course, is that languages and speech and communication doesn't fossilize. We don't have any hint of that we can look at. The good news is that our brains are very similar to other brains. And the differences are the result of the way they have developed differently. It's a slight tweak in development. Evolution is about changing the process of development from generation to generation, just subtly. Well, the process of developing human brains is changed slightly, which makes them larger, has changed a few connection patterns, changed some of the neurotransmission, and so on. Understanding those differences is the way we're going to get at these questions. So I spent really the first decade to 2 decades of my career as a graduate student and eventually a young professor, trying to answer the question, what's different about human brains? Because if I figure out what's different about human brains, I might figure out how this transition was made. It turns out that the 2 questions actually fit well together. What's different about human brains and what's different about communicating with symbols? The very ungroundedness of symbols that required somehow reusing iconic and indexical features in a different way, posed a different kind of thinking problem. And the problem had to do with the combinatorial features. In particular, the fact that we have to combine words to actually communicate anything. And so this allowed me to look at the brain differently and to say, oh, so what parts of the brain might have contributed to this capacity? It's not that we have some special language device plugged into the brain that makes language possible. It's just that we enhanced this capacity to make it possible so that we could make this shift that's so difficult for other species. And it turns out that I think that the major difference has to do with an area called the prefrontal cortex. And people have long wondered if the prefrontal cortex might be overdeveloped in humans. It's slightly larger than you'd predict for a brain even of our size, and considerably larger than for a brain of, say, chimpanzee size, about a third the size of ours. There are connection differences as well, connections from the motor cortex to the nucleus in our brainstem that controls the larynx and breathing, that allows us to precisely time vocalizations with the movement of my mouth and tongue, something that you couldn't do in other species because they don't have this direct connection. But it looks as though this direct connection is the result of this sort of expanded growth of the forebrain compared to this deep brain nucleus. The real problem is that, of course, this didn't precede language. It's not that this happened and then language can pop into place. It happened slowly, and we can guess at that by looking at the developmental processes that are necessary and also looking at the way brain sizes changed from our ancestors. And we know at least the size information, although structure information, even though people think they can tell by looking at shapes of skulls and things like that, I think that's pretty unlikely. But we can know that in order to build a brain of a different size, using the same kind of plan that other apes use, that certain things had to be tweaked in certain ways. And that probably took place over the course of almost 2 million years, I think. And what it suggests to me is that early on in this process, a little bit of symbolic communication had to have been possible. The very minimal capacities. But that demanded much more work for certain parts of our brain. And as a result, those who, by chance, had slight modifications neurologically to make that combinatorial analysis easier would acquire this symbolic capacity a little bit better. I actually think it didn't begin linguistically. I think it probably began something looking more like a ritual looks like, where we can communicate about things by this complicated mixture of icons, indices, and to create symbols. One of the things about a symbol is it's created by these relationships between icons and indices. So when I use a particular word, it's because it brings to mind these relationships to other words and other events and other properties and principles and so on. It's these relationships, this network of relationships, that's critical. Well, that's, of course, what we do when we construct a ritual. We bring things into relationship in a particular way. So I think that the early process begins probably somewhere close to almost 2 million years ago. about 500,000 years after we see the first appearance of stone tools. And what had to happen, of course, using stone tools, we have to cooperate in very different ways in order to gain access to this food source that stone tools allowed our early ancestors to gain access to. And that requires cooperation, but it also requires something a little bit like what Rousseau would call a social contract. Promises. You've got to know what to expect from somebody else. And you've got to have assurances that when I've got my head down in a carcass carving off a piece of meat, that my buddies are fending off the predators that want to get at it too, that would get at me if I wasn't paying attention. We've got to have that kind of trust. We've also got to have trust about sexual processes, about how we interact in mating and taking care of offspring and so on. A whole lot of new kinds of communication had to be necessary to sort of utilize this new simple technology, but to gain a food source. I think so. So what I've argued in my book, in The Symbolic Species, is that there was this co-evolutionary process, that very simple symbolic processes drove the evolution, caused brains to do a little better at acquiring them, which created better symbolic processes, which in turn sort of ratcheted up this process step by step by step until modern times. I think there are lots of other processes involved. One of them, in fact, I think requires loss of specificity. So some of my recent work has been to identify in species that have gone from a particular bird species we're looking at that's gone from an innate song to a socially acquired and socially transmitted song, is that actually there's been a loss of specificity, a loss of innate capacities that made this possible. I think there's been a loss of innate bias, innate specificity, as well as this specialization towards combinatorial capacity. I think a lot of things have happened in common that allow us to do what we do, but it's also allowed communication to become socially created and socially transmitted. So almost all of our communication now has this major capacity, which means that those of us in different language groups, of course, are tied off from each other, you know, because we don't have that translation. We don't have the common background because it's so social. But it took a long time to get here. And I don't think it's just a recent gloss on top of being a little more intelligent. Our brains are symbolic brains. I like to say that we have a symbolic nature. Instead of human nature, it's human symbolic nature. That is, everything about us has been modified by a couple of million years of adapting to this virtual world of symbols. We're not just adapting to the ecosystems we're in, we're now adapting to this very different ecosystem that's virtual. It's about what might happen, what could have happened, what should happen, what did happen. All of that is part of our evolution. And so I think our bodies and our brains reflect that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so at a certain point there you referred to, and I mean this is obvious, that language doesn't fossilize, and one of the main sources of evidence to study how language might have evolved are brains, and comparing our own brain with the brains of other species that are evolutionarily close to us. But at another point, you refer to the fact that perhaps we can extract or make some inferences about how people were communicating with each other through human tools. But I mean, since language is very related to our capacity to process symbolism, wouldn't you say that perhaps there are also other cultural artifacts, like, for example, artistic products that we can study archaeologically to try to get a sense of how people were processing symbols throughout our evolutionary history?
Part of the challenge is that what we would describe as non-functional artifacts, non-tools, are very recent. We don't see a lot of it. I would say some of the earliest ones are still only a few 100,000 years old. And one of the problems with symbolic communication, going right back to where we began this conversation, is what's absent. Sounds and gestures disappear immediately. The sounds that I'm uttering now, are gone, except that you're recording them. For the most part, nothing gets preserved. So one would imagine that for a good period, and I would say 80% to 90% of our prehistory, the symbols that were being used produce nothing. The problem is what gets things externalized. The challenge is that, to some extent, if we wanted to use evidence, external, clear fossil evidence or hard evidence of language, we would go to writing. Writing is our sure evidence that there's language being spoken because it's encoding the language. But writing is only, 8,000, 10,000 years old at the most. And in most parts of the world, not anywhere near that. But we can be sure that language preceded it for a long, long time. It's just that at that point in time, it became necessary to externalize it, to put it into an artifact that was preserved, that didn't dissipate into the atmosphere, so to speak. Well, when we look at cave paintings that might be 20 to 30,000 years old at the oldest, we should think the same thought. Now people are beginning to externalize something. Why did they externalize it? Why didn't they do it before this? Or were they doing it on artifacts that simply degraded over time? Carved wood, woven things that degraded. Now, one of the oldest, I think, interesting artifacts is this sort of pink hand axe that was found in Spain many years ago. Basically unused, are wonderfully carved, shaped into a hand axe, which has this sort of probably the oldest, longest used kind of tool in our ancestry, that was never used, but was carved out of this gorgeous pink stone, and seems to have been tossed into a repository, maybe even as a sort of a funeral-like object. It's one of the oldest ones, but it's one of the very few. My guess is that, first of all, we can't use the absence of externalized features, of externalized symbolic or iconic features, to gauge the timing of this stuff. On the other hand, what we can say is there, for some reason, it was important for the people in those days to externalize these things. And that's the question we want to ask. But when you externalize something, of course, it lasts a long time, and therefore it can have an influence long past your own influence. So today, we still are influenced by the writings of Greek literature and so on. Influenced by religious writings that are thousands of years old, that still drive major political and economic and religious movements around the world. Because artifacts persist and continually have communicative influence. That is a fairly recent phenomenon, and I think it's a phenomenon that begins this ratchet-like effect that we call history. Before that, I think it wasn't there. On the other hand, I do think that we have to recognize that some of these first things that show up, like the cave walls, paintings, or carvings that represent things, iconic things, are associated with something else that symbols provides. Symbols provide the ability, because of their combinatorial nature, to bring ideas together in new ways. I think that the arts are the result of this. The arts are not the kind of thing that you find in the rest of the animal world, because this combinatorial possibility is just so rare. Yes, you might find a little of that kind of stuff out there, but it's very, very minimal, or it only occurs in very, very special conditions. But with human beings, it somehow is right there. So this is why I say ritual. what we might say some of the original kinds of art, maybe even drumming or rhythmic activity, maybe even something a little bit like music would have been some of this first stuff. Playing a role as symbolic, but also as iconic and indexical, and playing a communicative role that was well beyond what we would call language. So one of the things that's unique about us is not only our ability to do this, but our desire to experience it and to make it. I mean, this is an attractive thing. We really like this stuff. So it basically says that to some features of our symbolic nature, so to speak, bias us towards not only being able to do it, but wanting to do it, being attracted to it, because this is a way of sort of building this larger symbolic world around us. I think it also has changed us in another important way. We have, and this is a neurological issue in some sense, and that is all mammal brains do memory in two very different, orthogonal, sort of independent ways. Memory is the result of redundancy, of repetition of things. We know that we learn skills by repeating something over and over again. And in effect, cutting, you might say, cutting deeper and deeper channels into the synaptic pathways so that things become more automatic, more efficient, and so on by virtue of repetition. We call this procedural memory. And to some extent, the more we get good at something, the less conscious it is. It's more like what a computer does. In a sense, it's becoming, a one-track mind, so to speak, a one-trick pony, as it's sometimes described. On the other hand, to remember what you were doing just before lunch yesterday, you didn't have a chance to repeat that. That happened once. But by me just mentioning it, you can probably go back to figure out what it was. You can remember that, even though it was not repeated. And most of the episodes in our life don't have that kind of repetition. They have a sort of theme and variation, especially if we have sort of predictable lives. And we use that theme and variation oftentimes to go back and find it, to structure our memories. That kind of memory is called an episodic memory, episodes, so to speak. Sometimes it's called declarative memory because we can describe and we can declare what happened, so to speak. I think that's a misnomer because it sneaks language into the game. But what's interesting about language is that we acquire our ability to speak and understand language procedurally by repeatedly experiencing this throughout the first years of our lives. We don't actually remember the episodes that we learned all these words in. And there's a good reason for that, that the episodic memory actually develops quite a bit later. And these two memories involve very different kinds of the brain, different parts of the brain, because they have to do it differently. One has to do it by repetition, and episodes have to be remembered by association. So instead of redundancy by virtue of doing the same thing over and over again, it's redundancy about what things are in common. And this is how we typically find this. What else was I doing? What else? How can I zero in on this memory? We do it by association. But of course, language is something that is done using procedural memory, skill memory. I don't even have to think about it as I produce it now, to access our episodic memory. In fact, when I asked you about what you were doing before lunch yesterday, it was using that very capacity. Now, what that means is that then also an episode can trigger me to come up with new words and new terms procedurally to drive my access to new episodes. This ability to link episodes together into complicated sequences we call narrative or theory or explanation. What we've done by using language is we've totally restructured the nature of memory in a mammalian brain. We don't have new kinds of memory systems, but we're using this technology we call language, symbols, to restructure memory. So when I remember the stuff I'm talking about today, or you remember your childhood or who you are or what you're planning to do. We do it typically in something like stories, in narratives, or in theories or in explanations, where we've linked things together in these complicated memories. That's something that's unique to us as well, that language has given us, and so that we, in a sense, don't any longer live in just the immediate moment. We live in the coming future, my plans. We live in the past, where I came from, what I was doing before, why I'm doing what I am now, and we have the capacity to live in other people's stories as well. And that includes getting into each other's heads in ways that other species can't do, because I can tell you what I'm thinking, like I am now. And you can ask me questions to get into what I'm thinking, and I can do the same for you.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Deacon, today we've already covered a lot of topics coming from your work. So, just before we go, would you like to tell people perhaps what are some of the best places on the internet for them to go there and find more stuff about your work?
So we are in the process of constructing a website called Teleodynamics that will have most of the papers related to my work and other work. But there are some great new journals beginning in terms of semiotics. There's a journal called Cognitive Semiotics that's coming out that has now had a few years of work. Another journal called Biosemiotics that has a lot of applications of semiotic theories to biology. In terms of the work that I'm doing on information, I should mention that I'm the current president of an organization called the International Society for the Study of Information, and we're going to have this beginning June in Berkeley, the current meeting of this society, in which there's a lot of interest not in information just in the technical sense, but information in all of its broad senses. And that group, the initials IS4, number 4, SI, stand for that organization. And there's a subgroup called the Foundations of Information Science, FIS, in which there's an ongoing discussion about these issues. These are topics that are beginning to pop up all over the place. They're still fairly new. We have just begun to sort of move in this direction. But it's a good place to go to begin to see what's happening in these domains.
Okay, so I will be leaving links in the description box of this video for people to go to those places if they are interested, of course. So, Dr. Deacon, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was really a pleasure to everyone.
It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons KARIN, LIETZCKE, and BLANCHETTE, Per HELGE, LARSEN, GUERREIRO, CHANTEL, GELINAS, and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.